As I set the last cup on the kitchen table, a sense of unease settled over me. It wasn't exactly fear, but more of a heavy, pressing feeling, like the stillness right before a storm hits. It twisted in my gut as I read my sister's letter again. There had been no call, no hints of anything unusual. Yet here was this message, brief and to the point. Her son would be spending the summer with me, alone, at my remote lake house. She'd said he needed a change of pace, a reset, as she put it. But something in the tone of her words felt off, like there was more behind them, something hidden just beneath the surface. It left me questioning everything I knew about her and about her son. My lake house had always been my escape, an oasis away from the chaos of daily life, tucked in a quiet corner surrounded by trees and water. The idea of sharing it, even with family, stirred up an uneasiness I couldn't quite pinpoint. Before I had time to fully process it, I heard the hum of an approaching engine and the crunch of tires on gravel. My breath hitched in my chest. He wasn't supposed to arrive until tomorrow. I barely had a moment to realize he was already here. I hadn't even wrapped my head around the fact that he was early. I stepped out onto the porch, forcing a nervous smile as I watched his car pull up the driveway. This wasn't a familiar scene. No longer a child, but a tall, lean young man, his serious expression focused as he parked. Gone were the round cheeks and the wide-eyed innocence I remembered. He now carried an air of confidence, a quiet defiance that caught me off guard. His gaze was unreadable as he finally looked up and met my eyes. I saw a flicker of recognition, mixed with something else I couldn't name. But then he stepped out of the car. I struggled to find my voice. "You're early," I said, managing a smile as I walked toward him. I wanted to make it seem like a normal family reunion, but the words felt stiff, almost formal. His expression didn't change as he nodded, offering a small, polite smile in return. "Yeah," he said, glancing around. He took in the surroundings with an expression I couldn't place. "Thought I'd surprise you." We stood there in silence, the air thick with unspoken questions that I couldn't bring myself to voice. The only sound was the distant chirping of birds. I gestured toward the house, feeling like I was stepping into a new chapter of my life without knowing what was coming next. As we walked inside, my usual comfort with the place began to slip away. His presence, this young man, family, yet still a stranger, was changing the space I had always called my own. He moved slowly through the room, his eyes scanning everything with a clinical curiosity, as if he was cataloging the details. I watched him from the doorway, a sense of tension building in me. He was someone I knew, but didn't really know. His quiet assessment of my world felt intrusive, unsettling. "Make yourself at home," I finally said, breaking the silence. The words felt strangely formal, even to me. "Thanks," he replied simply, still taking in his surroundings before his eyes met mine again. There was an intensity in his gaze, an awareness that seemed far beyond his years. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just a product of growing up. After all, he was nearly an adult now. But even as I tried to shake off the strange weight in the air, it lingered. A reminder that this summer would be like no other. I led him to the guest room, showing him where to find towels and giving him the usual rundown of the place as he dropped his bag. I was about to turn and leave when a single word made me pause. "Yes?" I asked, a flicker of relief at hearing my name from him. He hesitated for a moment, his face softening just enough before returning to that unreadable calm. "Thanks for letting me stay here." The way he said it, with quiet intensity, made me stop in my tracks. It was a simple sentiment, but there was something in his tone, an edge, that I couldn't quite place. "Of course," I replied too quickly, eager to ease whatever tension was hanging in the air. "It'll be nice to have company for a change." He nodded, offering another small, polite smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. I could feel his gaze on me as I turned to leave, and the air between us was thick with something unsaid, something barely beneath the surface. Back in the kitchen, I tried to focus on making coffee, hoping the familiar routine would shake off the strange feeling that had followed me since his arrival. The sound of the coffee machine filled the room, grounding me for a moment. But no matter how normal the task felt, The questions kept buzzing at the back of my mind. Why had he come so suddenly? Why the guarded looks and distant gaze? My sister's letter kept replaying in my head, its tone more urgent now that he was here in person. As the coffee brewed, I glanced out the window and saw him standing on the back porch, his hands in his pockets, as he looked out over the lake. He appeared so alone, framed by the stillness of the water and the quiet of the trees. In that moment, I felt a wave of unexpected emotion, a mix of protectiveness and unease. He seemed caught between two worlds, a young man still tethered to his childhood, yet reaching for something he couldn't quite grasp. I wanted to go to him, to break the silence, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just stood there, watching him from the kitchen window, as if standing on the edge of something I couldn't see, but could feel nonetheless. As the last rays of the setting sun cast long shadows across the yard, I realized that whatever this summer brought, it would be unlike any that had come before it. When he came back inside, our eyes met, and I felt a jolt of something unspoken and unplayable, that lingered long after he disappeared into his room for the night. I couldn't shake the feeling that this summer was going to change everything. Somehow, in ways I couldn't yet fully grasp, I knew I'd be different by the end of it. What that would mean or how it would play out was still hidden in the shadowy corners of the house, waiting to reveal itself. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting a soft glow over the table where I sat with my coffee. I hadn't slept much, the quiet presence of someone else in the house keeping me awake. The usual morning sounds, the birds, the soft rustling of the trees, felt louder somehow in the stillness, a stark contrast to the restless thoughts running through my mind. Having him here was strange. I kept telling myself to relax, that this was just family time, but the tension from yesterday still lingered, an undercurrent I couldn't shake. I heard him stir, his footsteps light on the stairs, before he appeared in the doorway. He looked different, maybe more at ease, but still carried that same guarded expression. He nodded at me, a small smile pulling at the corner of his mouth as he poured himself a cup of coffee and joined me at the table. "Quiet place," he commented, glancing around. "Yeah," I replied, nodding. "It's peaceful. Thought it might be good for you, actually. Away from all the noise." I tried to sound casual, but even as I spoke, I could feel his eyes on me, like he was studying my every word. He didn't answer, just sipped his coffee, his gaze shifting from me to the window. I wanted to fill the silence, but nothing seemed right to say. The air between us felt thick, and I shifted uncomfortably under his watchful eyes. After breakfast, he wandered off to explore, and I tried to lose myself in my usual routine, the comfort of familiar tasks grounding me. But as the hours passed, I couldn't ignore the fact that something had shifted between us. Every time he passed by, I felt his presence like a weight pressing into the quiet spaces of the house. Later, we found ourselves outside, walking along the edge of the lake. The afternoon sun sparkled on the water, casting dancing reflections that flickered across our faces. He was quiet, lost in his thoughts, and I felt this strange urge to reach out, to connect with him somehow. But the words wouldn't come. "You know," he said suddenly, breaking the silence, "I don't remember this place much. Just bits and pieces." I nodded, glancing at him. "That's understandable. You were so young the last time you were here." He stopped, turning to face me with a strange intensity in his eyes. "It's like I remember you more than the place." His words took me by surprise, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. He held my gaze, something undefinable flickering in his expression. A warmth rushed to my cheeks, an unexpected reaction that left me flustered. There was something in his tone, maturity that didn't quite fit, that left me momentarily speechless. Before I could gather my thoughts, he turned away, his eyes drifting back to the lake, and the moment passed as quickly as it had come. But that brief exchange stayed with me, echoing in a way I couldn't fully understand. As the days passed, we fell into a routine. The quiet of the house was slowly filled with the hum of daily life. Every morning, he joined me for coffee, and we'd sit in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher over the trees. The routine was comforting, but the underlying tension never quite faded. It remained subtle and unspoken. One late afternoon, he appeared in the kitchen with a new spark in his eyes, something bright and different breaking through his usual reserve. "Can we go out to the garden?" he asked, leaning against the counter. I looked up, surprised. "The garden? Sure, but what's got you thinking about that?" He shrugged, his gaze drifting to the window. "I was just thinking about the melons. You remember? We planted them together last year." My heart skipped a beat. Caught off guard by the memory, I hadn't expected him to remember. I'd almost forgotten about that day, working together in the garden, laughing as we pressed seeds into the soil. He had been younger then, full of that infectious enthusiasm. It felt like something from another time, another life. "You remember?" I asked softly, the surprise clear in my voice. He looked at me, a small smile playing on his lips. "Of course. I wanted to see if they grew all right," he said, still with that same quiet intensity. "Let's go check." We stepped out into the warm late afternoon light, crossing the yard toward the garden tucked behind a row of trees. The air was heavy with summer heat, the earthy aroma of the garden filling the space as we drew closer. When we reached the rows of plants, he knelt down beside the vines, his fingers brushing gently over the leaves. I watched him, captivated by his focus, the way he lost himself in the simple task. Then he looked up, his face lighting up as he spotted a few melons, round and green, hidden beneath the foliage. "There they are," he said softly, almost to himself. I knelt beside him, reaching out to touch one of the fruits, feeling its firm, smooth surface. "They've grown so well," I said. "I didn't expect them to take. Honestly, I thought you'd forgotten all about it." He shook his head, glancing at me with that same intensity. "No, I didn't forget. I remember everything about that day. It was nice." We sat there for a moment, side by side, surrounded by the quiet hum of the garden. The air felt warm, comfortable, like a soft blanket wrapping around us. But beneath it, I could still feel the same tension simmering, an awareness hanging between us that I couldn't ignore. We stood up, brushing the dirt from our hands, and began making our way back to the house. The shadows had lengthened, stretching across the yard as the sun sank lower, bathing everything in a soft, golden light. He walked beside me, and I felt his gaze on me, steady and unblinking, as if he were seeing me in a way I hadn't expected. As we neared the back porch, he stopped, looking at me with that same intensity that had unsettled me in the kitchen a few mornings ago. He spoke quietly, his voice soft, almost uncertain. I turned to face him, trying to read his expression, but instead of speaking, he leaned forward, closing the distance between us in a single, swift motion. It was over in an instant, unexpected and quick, leaving me frozen in place, stunned. He pulled away just as fast, his expression unreadable as he looked at me. I opened my mouth, wanting to say something, anything, to break the silence that had suddenly settled between us. But no words came. We stood there, the weight of what had just happened hanging between us like an unsaid secret. The air around us felt thick, almost suffocating, and I struggled to find the right words to ease the tension. But he simply stepped back, offering a small, almost shy smile before turning toward the house. I watched him walk away, a strange mix of confusion and curiosity stirring within me, the brief moment replaying in my mind like a dream. By the time I collected myself enough to follow him, he had already disappeared inside. I lingered for a moment, letting the cool evening air wash over me, trying to shake the strange, lingering feeling that clung to me. It felt as if something had shifted between us, something subtle and unspoken, creeping up on us when we weren't paying attention. As I turned to head inside, I couldn't escape the feeling that this summer was changing things in ways I hadn't expected, drawing us into a new kind of understanding, one that felt both familiar and completely new. The next morning dawned quietly, sunlight filtering softly through the curtains as I sat alone in the living room, a book open on my lap. The atmosphere in the house felt different, heavier somehow, as if the walls had absorbed the tension that had been building between us. My thoughts kept drifting back to the moment in the garden, the fleeting touch, the look in his eyes that I couldn't decipher. I couldn't shake it off, couldn't make sense of it. And the uncertainty it left behind kept me on edge. I heard his footsteps as he came down the stairs, each step deliberate and slow, and I felt a pang of anticipation I couldn't ignore. He entered the room with his usual casual expression, offering a small, almost tentative smile, but his eyes held something more, something that made me feel like he was searching for something I wasn't sure I could give. I closed the book and set it aside, trying to find a way to break the silence, but he beat me to it. "I saw that old diary on the shelf upstairs," he said, nodding toward the hallway. "Is it yours?" I was caught off guard, surprised that he had even noticed. "Yes," I replied, a strange mix of nostalgia and vulnerability filling me. "It's from my teenage years. I haven't read it in ages." He hesitated, as if carefully considering his next words. "Would you read something from it, if that's okay?" The request felt unexpectedly intimate, as if he were asking to see a part of me I'd long ago tucked away. But there was a sincerity in his voice, a curiosity that seemed almost earnest. I nodded, motioning for him to follow me as I led him upstairs to the small study where I kept my old journals. They were filled with pieces of my younger self, thoughts, hopes, dreams, pages filled with a life I'd once lived. We sat on the floor by the window, the diary resting between us. I opened it carefully, letting my fingers linger over the faded ink before I began reading aloud. My voice was soft as I let myself slip back into memories I hadn't revisited in years. The words felt alive again, and I could almost feel the past wrapping around me. As I read, I noticed him watching me intently, his gaze focused, as though he were trying to read something deeper between the lines. It was strange to share these words with him, to offer up parts of myself I had almost forgotten. When I reached a passage about a summer crush, I hesitated, glancing up at him, unsure of how he'd react. But he just listened, his expression calm, absorbing each word without judgment. When I finished, the room fell into silence, and for a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. He looked down at his hands, deep in thought, before lifting his gaze to meet mine. The intensity in his eyes made my heart skip a beat. "You wrote beautifully," he said softly, breaking the silence. "It's like I can feel everything you were going through." I didn't know how to respond, my cheeks flushing at his words. There was such genuine honesty in his voice, a sincerity that made me feel exposed in a way I hadn't expected. I wanted to thank him, to tell him how much his words meant, but before I could speak, his hand brushed against mine. It was a small, simple gesture, but it felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. The room seemed to shrink around us, the walls pressing in as our hands lingered for a moment, his touch warm against my skin. I pulled my hand back gently, offering a nervous smile as I tried to break the tension. "Thank you for listening," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I haven't thought about those days in so long." He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "It feels like you're a different person in those pages. But still, somehow, the same." His words struck a deep chord within me, echoing in ways that left me feeling both comforted and unsettled. It was as if he had seen something in me, something I hadn't realized I'd left behind. I wanted to say something, anything, that would connect with him, but the words just wouldn't come. After a moment, he stood, brushing the dirt off his hands, his eyes drifting out the window. "It's strange, isn't it? How things change, but still somehow stay the same." I nodded, watching his gaze sweep over the landscape, the sunlight stretching across the yard in long, golden rays. "Yes," I murmured, my voice almost lost in the quiet. "It really is." We left the room in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, the memories between us lingering like a forgotten song we couldn't quite place. Downstairs, I tried to keep busy, distract myself with small, mindless tasks. But I couldn't escape it. His presence. It hung in the air between us, thick with everything that remained unsaid. As the day wore on, the sun sank lower, casting warm, amber light through the windows. I caught glimpses of him as he moved through the house, reading by the window or wandering from room to room. Every time, I felt that odd pull, like an invisible thread connecting us, something deeper than just family. It was something unspoken, something beyond understanding. By evening, he joined me on the porch. We sat there in the fading light, both of us watching the sky shift into hues of pink and purple, the silence between us heavy, but somehow comfortable. It felt like we were waiting for something to happen. An unasked question, an answer neither of us had dared to voice. In that moment, I realized this summer wasn't just changing him, it was changing me too. The lake house, once so familiar and comforting, now felt like a place of transition. The quiet of the night wrapped itself around me, the stars scattered across the sky like pieces of a dream. I lay awake that night, unable to escape the thoughts swirling in my head, the words he'd said, the look in his eyes, the way he'd listened so intently as I read from my journal, hanging on to every word like it mattered. Each memory I shared felt like a thread pulling me back to things I'd long since tucked away. Unable to sleep, I wrapped myself in a sweater and stepped out onto the porch. The night air was cool, a gentle breeze stirring the trees, and everything around me felt so still that even the faintest noise seemed louder than usual. I stood there, staring across the lake, the moon casting its silver glow over the water. I tried to find peace in the quiet, to clear my head, but then I heard the soft creak of a floorboard behind me, and I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his silhouette bathed in the soft kitchen light. "I couldn't sleep either," he said, his voice low and almost hesitant, stepping out beside me. We stood there, side by side, in the stillness, watching the stars reflect off the water. For a moment, it was like we were the only two people left in the world. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, it was just there. A space filled with unspoken understanding. Then he spoke, his voice softer than before. "I feel like there's so much I don't get. About everything. Like I'm supposed to have all the answers, but I don't." I nodded, his words hitting me harder than I expected. "I think everyone feels like that. Even adults. We just get better at pretending we've got it figured out." He looked down, his hands resting on the railing of the porch. "It's just, I don't know how to be who everyone expects me to be. There's so much pressure. So many things I'm not ready for." His eyes wandered to the lake again, his expression distant, lost in thought. "But here it's different. It feels like I can actually think. Like maybe I don't have to have everything figured out right now." I wanted to reassure him, to tell him it was okay to not have all the answers, that the pressure to be something didn't have to weigh him down. But the words stuck, lodged somewhere deep inside me. It was rare to see him this open, this vulnerable. Without thinking, I reached out and placed a hand gently on his arm, a small, grounding gesture. He turned to look at me, his gaze searching mine, as if asking for something I wasn't sure I could give. I held his stare, the weight of his thoughts and fears pressing against me. In that instant, I wanted to tell him everything, that he wasn't alone, that he didn't have to carry the burden of expectations, that he was enough just as he was. But my voice faltered, trapped in the space between us. Then he reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. It was a simple touch, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I felt his hand tighten around mine, a quiet desperation in the way he held on, as if afraid to let go. The world seemed to fade around us. The sounds of the trees, the whisper of the wind, all became distant, as though time itself had slowed. We stood there, frozen in place, unwilling to break the connection. For a heartbeat, everything else ceased to exist. But then, as if snapping out of a dream, he pulled his hand away, and the moment was gone. I pulled my hand back, wrapping my arms around myself, the cool night air suddenly reminding me of where we were. I took a deep breath, letting the silence fall over us once more. He stepped away, his gaze dropping to the ground, and I saw something flicker in his expression, maybe disappointment, maybe confusion. It was hard to tell. I wanted to say something, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, we stood there, the air between us thick with unspoken thoughts, a fragile thread that neither of us knew how to untangle. After what felt like an eternity, He cleared his throat, his voice barely audible. "Thanks for listening," he murmured, the words tentative, like he wasn't sure if he'd said too much. "Of course," I replied softly, my voice almost drowned by the stillness. "You can talk to me anytime." He nodded, offering a small, almost shy smile. For the first time, I saw a glimmer of relief in his eyes, like my words had lifted some weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. We stood in silence a while longer, side by side, letting the night stretch on. The quiet of the world wrapped around us, as though it was holding us together in this moment. As the stars began to dim and the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon, he turned, looking back at the house. "Guess I should try to sleep," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion. I nodded, feeling an unexpected ache in my chest as I watched him walk away, his figure disappearing into the shadows of the house. Once he was gone, I stayed out on the porch, watching as the sky slowly began to lighten, the world waking up around me. I felt a strange, bittersweet pull, a jumble of emotions that I couldn't quite untangle. It was as though the night had revealed something new about him, about me, that we hadn't fully seen before. A quiet vulnerability that left me both comforted and deeply unsettled. There was something in his openness, in his raw honesty, that had shifted the air between us. It left me with a feeling I couldn't quite name. As I finally made my way back inside, the silence of the house felt heavier than it had before. The room seemed to hold the weight of everything we hadn't said. And even though the morning light bathed everything in a soft glow, I couldn't shake the feeling that the night had marked something significant. A moment that would linger, shaping the days to come in ways I wasn't yet ready to understand. As the summer days slowly dwindled, a quiet sadness settled over the house. Our time together was winding down, and even though we rarely spoke of it, the knowledge hung between us. It lingered in the glances we exchanged, in the small gestures we shared. We spent those last days in an unspoken harmony, each of us careful not to disrupt the fragile peace we had found. On his last evening, he joined me on the porch as the sun sank below the lake, bathing everything in warm shades of orange and gold. We didn't speak. Words felt unnecessary, even intrusive. Instead, we sat quietly, side by side, letting the silence stretch between us, heavy with everything left unsaid. I wondered if he felt the same ache, the same bittersweet confusion I couldn't seem to shake. Finally, he turned to me, his expression soft, almost wistful. "This place, it feels like it's part of me now," he murmured, his gaze drifting over the lake, the trees, the fading light. "I'll remember it always." His words hit me, deep and unnameable. I felt a pang in my chest, an emotion I couldn't put into words. I wanted to tell him that he was welcome back anytime, that this place would always be here for him. But somehow I knew he already understood. We stood up, lingering at the edge of the porch, as though we were both trying to prolong the moment. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out, and for a second, everything felt both familiar and new. I thought he might say something else, but instead, he just looked at me, his eyes filled with an intensity one couldn't quite place. Then, without a word, he pulled me into a hug. It was warm, full of unspoken gratitude, a final gesture that felt both comforting and final. I wrapped my arms around him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against mine. For a moment, everything else disappeared. There was only the quiet, the shared understanding, the wordless goodbye. When he pulled back, he gave me one last lingering look. "Goodbye," he whispered, his voice soft but heavy with meaning. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward his car, disappearing down the winding path, never once looking back. I stood there, alone on the porch, watching him disappear into the night. A surprising calm washed over me. It was as if everything had come full circle, like the summer, with all its quiet moments and untold stories, had left a mark on both of us. As I looked up at the stars, one by one filling the night sky, I felt a strange sense of comfort, like a part of him still lingered in the stillness of the world around me.